Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Today we continue on from our last video where we were discussing the Prophet. And if you remember, our goal was to look at him with a purely secular perspective. And today we will do that through the eyes of people who saw the Prophet and spent time with him in person. We will look at what they said about the Prophet's character, his personality, his activism, and also his appearance. Now, what better way to look at someone's real character than by looking at what his family say about him? So let's start by looking at what the Prophet's wives said about him. And the one thing that the Prophet's wives say about him is that we always found him smiling. They are unanimous in that. They say he was always in a very good mood around us, and he was very easy to deal with. He was very lenient. They also say that he was always helping around the house. He was helping out with the household chores. And I believe that's something we can all learn from. The wives actually tell us that the Prophet used to sew his own clothes and even fix his own shoes at home. And the reality is that even with the detail of Prophet's life available to us, there is not a single time that one of the Prophet's wives complain about his behavior or say that they were mistreated by him in his life and even after his death. And this thing about him being cheerful and always in a good mood, everybody who met him or talks about him mentions this specific trait. Even the general public of Medina, they say that whenever we met Rasulullah, there wasn't a time when he did not greet us cheerfully. And to be honest, for me personally, it's quite amazing considering, the responsibility that he would have always had on his mind. And similar to how he was, you will always find him preaching others and ordering others to be easygoing and act with leniency. Now, similar to his wives, we also look at, for example, Anas bin Malik, who used to work in Rasulullah's house. Listen to what he has to say. So he says that I worked in the Prophet's house for 10 years. And he says that in those 10 years, never once did I hear him say, why did you do this way and not that way? Or why did you not do this? He says that the Prophet never scolded me or spoke to me with annoyance in 10 years. And you will find, as I said, you'll find these narrations which talk about, and there's an overall trend explaining how the Prophet was easygoing and very lenient and never angry about anything until he saw someone's right being taken, though, or he saw a transgression in his presence. They say that if the Prophet ever saw transgression or somebody being oppressed, then there was no leniency in his behavior, and he would not calm down until rights were restored, especially rights of the weak. And here there's a very interesting story. So before the advent of Islam, before the Prophet's claim to prophethood, he was part of an organization called the Hilful Fudul. And this was basically a group of people in Mecca who had come together and sworn that they will fight for the rights of the weak. So it wasn't a religious organization. There weren't Muslims in this organization as such, but their goal was justice. And the Prophet, even decades later, when after the claim of his prophethood, he actually mentions this pact and says that it was something. If he was called to something similar even today, he would still respond to it. And you will notice that even before the prophethood, the prophet's character was absolutely flawless. I mean, for the first 40 years of his life, he lived like a regular human being. But in that time, his credibility was such that he was known by his people, by the city in which he lived in. He was known as the truthful and the trustworthy only because of how he lived. And even his staunchest enemies could never find any fault in his character. And the next video will actually talk about this through a letter which the prophet wrote to Caesar, the Roman emperor at the time. Right. So, what did the prophet look like? We have a lot of narrations which talk about his physical appearance and his body language, and all of them talk along the same lines. You will find that everybody who met the prophet or saw him, even from far away, said that there was something extraordinary about him. People say we can't really compare him to anybody we had seen before, nor anybody we ever saw after him. And on this, there's a narration from a lady called Ma'bad, who actually saw the Prophet when he was traveling from Mecca to Medina to save his life. So later she tells her husband what she saw. And so she says, I certainly saw a man who was very, very blessed. He was a blessed person. She says, his neatness and his cleanliness were very apparent. He was super duper neat. Now, pausing for a second here, keep in mind that the Prophet had been traveling for weeks and had been in a cave for 4 days right before this. And yet she says that the Prophet was extremely neat. He looked extremely neat. She says that he had a very good looking, a very handsome face. He wasn't fat, she says. His chest and his stomach were in line with each other. Basically, another way of saying that he had a flat tummy. And apparently, this was odd in those times as well. She says that his voice had an extraordinary resonance. He had very big and wide eyes. And she says that the whiteness of his eyes was very, very white, whereas the pupil was extremely black. So there was a certain, like, a unique contrast in his eyes. She says he looked unique from far away among other people. He wasn't very tall, she says, but he wasn't scornfully short either. When he was quiet, he had an aura of majesty around him. He didn't speak too much, but neither did he speak so little so as to be considered cold. His speech, in fact, were like pearls in a necklace, which basically means that it was very structured and organized. So when her husband heard this, he actually said, but by the gods, I think this is the same person that the Quraysh have been talking about. And he actually went after him and then promised to help him. So similarly, we have more people who have talked about the Prophet's physical traits, such as Hind Abu Hala, who says that the Prophet's face shone in the light like the moon. He had a very fair complexion, he says. And he talks about the body language of the Prophet. He said that when the Prophet gave attention to someone, he would turn his whole body towards them. So he wouldn't look at them like that or give them half attention. He would physically face them, square up against them, and give them full attention with his body as well. He also says that that the extent of the Prophet's laugh was just a smile. So he didn't laugh loud, he would just smile. And he says that when he laughed, you could see his teeth. And he says that these teeth were as white as hailstones, he says. So it was as white as ice. He also says that, and this is something other people have said as well about the Prophet. They say that he had a very, very unique way of walking. So they said that he walked very deliberately, and sometimes it almost looked like he's walking downhill, is the way they explained it. And they also say that when he pointed towards someone, he would do it with his entire hand. He would point like that, so he wouldn't point with a finger. Now, this is actually a very interesting narration for me because some time ago I was looking at a research paper by Harvard, the Harvard Business School, and they conducted a research to determine the best body language for public speaking. And the paper essentially established the best way to point towards someone or something. So they said that there's basically three ways that people point. So you can point at someone with your finger, or you can point at someone with your hand, with your full hand, palm facing down, or you can point at them with your hand, palm facing up. And they determined that the best way to point towards someone is to use your full hand with your palm facing upwards. So when I read that the Prophet actually used to point this way, it was a very surprising narration for me. Another recurring comment that you will find on the Prophet is that he was an he was an excellent listener. So the companions, they say that the Prophet never interrupted anybody when they were speaking, and he wouldn't start speaking until a person kept talking and talking, and they themselves stopped talking, and only then would the Prophet start speaking. And actually, the Quran also alludes to this. The Quran actually says that that these people, they called you an ear, literally an ear, and that was because of how the Prophet was ready to listen to anybody, whether it be someone high in society or someone not so well in society, and then he basically paid attention to everybody. Another thing, which is something that Imam Ali says about the Prophet, and this is just to wrap it all up, is that the Prophet could not be provoked. So he said that there was no way you could anger the Prophet or annoy the Prophet. Nobody could do that. And the this was actually one of the traits of the prophets mentioned in one of the earlier books which the Jews and the Christians had with them. So this was basically a short trailer into the prophet's personality with a secular perspective. And as part of this, all that is remaining now is for us to look at what the prophet's enemies said about him. And we will do that in the next video through the story of the prophet's letter to the Roman emperor of the time, whose name was Heraclius.